It's October 12th, 2006, and my name is Dave Paddon, and I'm talking to my mother, Sheila Paddon, about her experiences of life in Labrador, beginning from when she first came there.
Well, after the war was over and things settled down a little, I was beginning to think that I'd like to go overseas and work as a nurse for a time. And I had thought of perhaps making inquiries about going to the Falkland Islands because excuse me, I had heard that they were wanting nurses, but that really didn't come to anything very much. The other place was the Kentucky Nursing Service in the States, but that was difficult because of all sorts of restrictions entering the United States. But the one thing that appealed to me so very much about Kentucky was that they gave you a horse to ride, and you did your nursing from place to place on horseback. So after that, I began to think about going to Labrador with the Grenfell Mission. And I had heard a great deal about the Grenfell Mission from a doctor that I met during the war, who had worked in Labrador earlier at a place called Mary's River on the coast. And he was very insistent on the fact that it would be a good idea if I was looking for somewhere to go to Labrador, because he thought that I would like it and it would suit me very well. So in early 1949, I think it was about February, I went to London to the headquarters of the Grenfell Association of Great Britain and Ireland, which was in Victoria Street in London. And the office there was run by Miss Seabrook, Betty Seabrook, and she'd been there many years. So I went up and I had an appointment and I met her and I said I'd like to go to Labrador. I thought I did. And she asked me many questions and in the outcome was that she would send my particulars to the committee and the committee would look at them. And so I gave her my nursing experiences and examinations I had and qualifications and so on. And she said, well, I'll let you know. So I went home again. And I was at home and I didn't hear anything for some time, but I think it was in May I heard from her to say, yes, they needed a nurse at a place called St.Anthony in Newfoundland. And they would like me to go out there as soon as arrangements could be made. And so there were one or two particulars I had to see to. I would go as a volunteer. Now in those days there were two contracts. You either signed on with the Grenfell Mission for 4 years, and that was 4 years straight, so no vacation, holidays, something like that. Or you could go for 6 months as a volunteer, in which case you didn't receive any pay. If you went for the 4-year contract, you were paid a small amount. But I said, no, I'll just go for 6 months. And I remember, one thing I do remember was that I had to give the Grenfell Mission £40 in sterling before I left. I think this was supposed to cover my expenses in St. Anthony. As I was a volunteer, I wouldn't be paid. Anyway, I was also given a clothing list of things that I should take to wear, that would be suitable, and a few more details. And then I was told that there would be a boat out of Liverpool on a certain date, sailing from Liverpool to St. John's in Newfoundland. And she was the SS Nova Scotia, or possibly the SS Newfoundland. There were the two vessels owned by the Furness Withy Company, and they sailed regularly from Liverpool to St. John's, to Halifax, to Boston, the round trip. So it all went quite well, and I went aboard the ship in Liverpool and set off for St. John's. I remember I shared a cabin with a girl from Newfoundland who had been training in London as a nurse. She came from Belle Island, and the voyage took about 7 days, I think. It was pretty rough. I remember being very seasick. But, however, finally we arrived in St. John's, and it became a little confusing after that, because I had been told in London that I would be met in St. John's on arrival by the secretary of the Grenfell Mission, who had her office in St. John's. And she would be there, and she would take me to the hotel or wherever I was going, and she would have arranged my passage to St. Anthony. However, it so happened that she wasn't there. In fact, there wasn't anybody on the dock on my arrival. All the passengers went ashore and went home or wherever they were going. I was eventually found myself really quite alone and wondering what I should do and where I should go, because, of course, I didn't have any funds. And after some time, I thought the best thing to do was go back aboard the ship, which I did, and I asked the purser if I could have my cabin for one night. And he didn't like it very much, but he said yes. And so I went back to my cabin. I thought, well, tomorrow Miss Garland will be on the dock and all will be well. However, it didn't work quite like that. And in the early morning, somebody came to my cabin. A very tall gentleman came, and he asked me if I was Miss Fortescue, and I was to go with him. So I went with him and went ashore, and he took me to the Newfoundland Hotel. I went up to the desk, and he didn't give me his name, but he seemed to be in charge, and he arranged for me to have a room at the hotel, and that was taken care of. Later I discovered that he was Dr. Clooney Macpherson, who was very well known in St. John's. I stayed at the hotel for some time, being that the ship that was to take me to St. Anthony from St. John's, the Kyle, the SS Kyle she was called, was icebound outside St. Anthony. Although this was June, the season was very late and the ice was still in the straits, and the vessel was icebound. She couldn't move. Therefore, there was no way of getting to St. Anthony until she came down to St. John's at whatever point she could sail. However, I was very anxious to get to work in St. Anthony, and after a few days I was told that there was a small airplane flying to St. Anthony, and possibly I would be able to have a ride aboard that small plane and get myself to St. Anthony. if I could find the pilot and ask him if he would take me. And after making several inquiries, I found out that the pilot was going to be at the hotel at a certain time and that he would be leaving the following day. And fortunately, I managed to contact him, and after some doubts on his part, he agreed that very well he would take me. He was going to fly to St. Anthony with a part for the deep sea, the fishing plant there. And so his instructions were that I was to be at a certain place, I think it was at 5 in the morning the following day, and we would take off from a pond. Now, when he said a pond, of course, a pond in England is not very big, but in Newfoundland, a pond can be a lake, a large lake, and it was called Kiddy Viddy or Kiddy Viddy, I wasn't sure, but I was to be there, and that was my instructions. And so I was there the next morning, and it was a small airplane, and he had a very large piece of machinery in it that he had to fly north, but he said he would take me, so I climbed in, and we took off on this pond, and we flew north. Most of the day, I seem to remember, because it was getting quite late and quite dark by the time we landed in a place called Bombay. Earlier in the day, which was the reason that we were delayed, he'd come down on a lake, Gander Lake it was called, because he had to get some parts for the flight, the plane in Gander. That was the town nearby. He told me to just wait and he would be back. He disappeared, and I waited by the side of the lake, and it was some time before he came back. And he found he had a little trouble with one of the floats that had sprung a leak, so he repaired that, and that took some time. So that delayed us on our way north. But however, we did arrive in Bombay. I don't mean Bombay, I mean Roddington. We arrived at Roddington, which was on the east coast of the northern peninsula of Newfoundland. And we obviously would have to stay there the night. It was quite dark by then. He took me to the nursing station. There was a nurse at several stations along the coast, Grenfell Mission nurses, and she had her station at Roddington. She was alone there. She'd been there many years. However, she very kindly let me in. No, I'm mistaken. She could not let me in because she was full. She had no beds. So we left there, and the pilot took me to another house where I was to stay the night. So he left. I don't know where he stayed. But I stayed the night at this house in Roddington with a family there. It was quite an experience, really. There was a very small bedroom, but there was the bed and a chair and a bucket in the corner. And the good lady said, well, here you are, stay here for the night. So I was about to lie down on the bed when a very large lady came in, who was also going to stay the night in that same room, apparently. So it worked out quite well. She had the bed, and I sat on the chair, and I was very tired, so it didn't really worry me very much, and went to sleep. But outside in the night, the dogs started to howl, and I knew nothing about these dogs. They sounded very like wolves to me, but obviously they couldn't have been wolves so close to the house, I thought to myself. So anyway, we all went well, and in the morning the pilot came for me, and we set off very early to fly to St. Anthony. However, after a time, we approached St.Anthony, and of course, looking down, he could see the Kyle, the vessel in the ice, and of course, there wasn't very much water for him to land, as he was on floats, and he had to land in the water. He flew about for some time, here and there, and finally found, I think, what he called a small lead in a small bay near St. Anthony, where he would bring the plane down, which he did very well. And we sat there on the water. And after a while, news must have got abroad that we were there, and eventually some people came out. They came out, and they had a canoe, and they had equipment to take us across the ice to the hospital at St. Anthony. He left. I didn't see him again, but I had arrived at St. Anthony. Well, the arrival was a little unprecedented, I would say, too, because they had no idea when I was going to arrive. In fact, they thought I wouldn't arrive at all until the Kyle, the vessel, had been down to St. John's to pick me up, to bring me back again. But here I was, and the head nurse was really quite annoyed, I'm afraid. She said, well, we didn't expect you yet. How did you arrive, and why are you here, and there isn't a room for you anyway. And it was all rather tiresome, my arrival, it seemed, which was a bit of a disappointment, because I thought perhaps they'd been waiting for me, as I was needed, but that was all right. Finally, I was taken up to Dr. Curtis's house. He was the superintendent, and he said that his wife would find a room for me, which she did very kindly. And so I arrived at St. Anthony for the 6 months as a volunteer nurse, and began working there. There were just 4 nurses in those days. There was another nurse from England and 2 American girls. There were 100 beds and 2 doctors. We were very busy. There was 1 nurse on night duty and 1 nurse in the operating room and 2 nurses on the wards. There was no set off duty. And it was a very busy time. But from the very first day, I enjoyed every moment of it. It was completely different from nursing in England, of course. The nursing wasn't any different, but the routine and the life in general was something that, of course, I had never experienced before. Patients came in off the vessels, off the Kyle and 1 or 2 other vessels, but they came in from the coast on their own boats, fishing boats, longliners and so on. Patients would arrive at any time with all manner of conditions. And off-duty was very, very short. There were no days off. If there was time, you went off-duty for an hour or 2. Otherwise, we worked all day, which was very good. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I was very fit and very interested. And I think the most, the difference between nursing, as I had known it in England, in large London hospitals with strict routine, strict discipline, especially during the war. Here, there was no seniority, there were only the 2 of you. You nursed as you'd been taught, and you did your best, and you dealt with every admission as it came. There were a few differences in the nursing technique, as I found out after a few days when I seemed to get into a lot of trouble with Dr. Curtis because of my treatment of a certain patient. Probably this is not very interesting to anybody who hasn't been a nurse, but I will just mention it. We had a man who had abdominal operation and very many stitches in his abdomen and drainage tubes and this and that. Well, I had been taught that on a certain day, on the 4th day, you took out so many stitches, and on the 6th day, you took out so many stitches, and on the 7th day, you shortened the drainage tubes, and this routine, and that is how we did it in England. I'd been doing it for years, so this is what I did. However, Dr. Curtis came to do his round to look at the wound and have found that the stitches had gone and the tubes had gone. And he was very angry, very, very angry. He said some very, what I thought, very rude things about English nurses. However, we had quite a set too. And he sent for me later in the day to his office. And I stood in front of him, and he was a irascible old man. And he told me what he thought of me and what he thought of English nurses in general. And it was a pity he couldn't only have American nurses because they knew what they were doing, and English nurses did not. So on, so at the end of it, he told me to go, so I went. However, that evening, when he came in to do a round of patients, he came along and he had a huge bunch of pansies in his hand. And he thrust them at me, and he said, "This is a small token of Anglo-American friendship." And he was gone again. And after that, we were the best of friends. However, I stayed there in St.Anthony with various excursions to the outports, to small settlements in that vicinity where the Grenfell Mission had nursing stations. And the hospital ship, the Marable, would sail from one station to the next, visiting all the people along the coast, going ashore, seeing all the children, and anybody who was sick. Sometimes there was a delivery, and there would be one nurse aboard the Marable, and the other nurse would be left alone at the hospital. This was, of course, very exciting to be aboard a ship. And she was a lovely little ship. So there was that. Then there was times when one of the nurses would be ill, and we would be down to 3 nurses. In fact, one nurse I became very friendly with, one of the American girls, contracted TB while she was there. TB was an absolute scourge, and there was no treatment to speak of then. There were no TB drugs then. All we could do was to put the patients out in the balconies so they were in the fresh air, and to give them as good a diet as possible. This girl became ill with TB, and she was nursed there and later sent home to the States, where she entered a sanatorium. Then we were down to 3 nurses. However, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a wonderful life. The people in St. Anthony were good to us. They were very kindly people and uncomplaining, always uncomplaining. And life was quite hard. Traveling was difficult. Diet was fair. I think we depended, and they depended a great deal on local diets, fish and berries and so on. But life was hard then, in 1949. It wasn't hard for me. but it was hard for the people. So the summer went by, and the time came, and I was to leave. That was December. June to December was my contract. But then, of course, there was the problem that as I wasn't paid, I had no money. And how was I to get back to England, which I didn't seem to have thought about very thoroughly, and nobody else had either. So I had my ticket from St. John's to Liverpool. That was assured, but really nothing else. Finally, I approached Dr. Curtis and suggested that I could go from St. Anthony to a place called Sydney and aboard the freighter. Her name was Nellie Clewett, and she brought supplies to St. Anthony of all kinds all through the summer. And then she made one last voyage in the winter to St. Anthony with supplies for the winter and returned to Sydney, where she was berthed for the winter. I thought this was a good idea. If I could go aboard her, I could get as far as this place, Sydney, which I wasn't very sure exactly where it was, but at least it was nearer to St. John's, I thought. Dr. Curtis wouldn't hear of it. He said it was ridiculous. I couldn't possibly go out aboard the Nellie Clewett. It was beginning to snow. She was a big, rather uncomfortable vessel, and the crew were four men, and it was unsuitable. No, I couldn't be done. But then, as I said, well, what else can I do? And I have to go home. My contract is up, and finally it was agreed that I should board the Nellie Clewett and get down to Sydney, where I would somehow find my way to St. John's. So this is what happened. I left in December in a snowstorm. It was very cold. And said goodbye to everybody on the dock. The hospital staff and some of the patients and many of the people I'd come to know and liked so well were on the dock to say goodbye. I remember very well shaking hands with them all, and they all looked a little worried, and I think I was the least worried, but then I didn't know what was ahead. And I boarded, and we sailed out of St. Anthony and down through the Straits of Belle Isle, and it was very rough and very cold and very uncomfortable. The 4 crew members, Captain Iverson and his son, and 2 others, of course, were quite at home. They'd been doing this for years and years. And they were remarkably good to me. They weren't used to having a young woman aboard, particularly one who'd never been on such a vessel before. However, we went along, and we got to Bombay, whereupon, for some reason, we stopped. And they put the anchor down, and they couldn't go any further. This was something to do with the weather, I think. But there we rocked back and forth, just off the coast at Bombay, for I think 2 or 3 days. I was very sick, very sick. That seasickness is where first you don't want to die, and then you do want to die. However, I remember saying, couldn't they put me ashore? I thought if I could get onto dry land, it would be better. No, they couldn't possibly put me ashore. No one could go ashore. However, after a while, we continued down to North Sydney, and we arrived at North Sydney, and we all went ashore, and that was the end of the voyage, and they said goodbye to me, and I had a little money. I had a little money with me. I remember I didn't know anybody, and I really wasn't quite sure how I was going to get to St.Anthony, but to St. John's. But I learned that there was a train from a place called Port au Basque to St. John's in Newfoundland, if I could get that far. I stayed in a hotel in Sydney, a rather small hotel, very dark, I remember. And I remember the good lady who showed me to a bedroom said that that's where Sir Wilfrid Grenfell lay. I don't know if she meant that he'd lay there just as passing through, or that he lay there because he was dead. She seemed to imply that he lay there for some time after he had died. However, that didn't worry me particularly. I was glad to be on dry land. Then I discovered that I could get a ferry from Sydney to this place, Port au Basque. I cannot remember how I did that or anything about it. Perhaps I borrowed some money, or somebody lent me some money or gave me some money. I can't remember that part of it at all. All I can remember now is arriving in Port au Basque and being given a ticket to St. John's on the railway, which was known as the Newfie Bullet. And so I boarded the train, and I remember sitting up. They had wooden seats, rather narrow wooden seats, which meant you sat bolt upright all the way. I think it took 2 days, but it might have been longer. But it's a long time ago now. And I arrived in St. John's and thought, well, now it's going to be easy because I have a ticket to England, and then I shall be in Liverpool, and then I shall be home. And when I arrived in St. John's, I went to the Grenfell Mission office on Water Street, saw Miss Garland there, and found that there was a letter there from Ruth Norman. And she had written to say that she was in the sanatorium in Boston, and I had promised to go and see her on my way back to England, if possible. And she'd very much like to see me, and she hoped I would be able to come down and see her. And so I went up to the hotel, and of course realized I didn't have any American money, very little money at all. However, I met a young man in the hotel who had been working at Hawke's Harbour with the whaling station there. He was on his way home. And he very kindly suggested that he would lend me his American, Canadian money, dollars, if it would be of any help. And that, of course, I would repay him in sterling when I got home. He was going home to England. And so I decided that I would go to Boston and see Ruth, and managed to get some sort of a visa, which was necessary. And so I went down to Boston. I arrived, I think it must have been in Independence Day. Or Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is in November, and it was probably Thanksgiving, yes. It was a general holiday, and I went to the YWCA building in Boston, and they said they could give me a room there for $5 a night, and So I took that, and I remember very well spreading out my money on the bed, counting it out, because I wasn't at all sure if it was going to last me or how I was going to manage. But all was well. There was on the opposite side of the street, there was a small little restaurant where they sold hot dogs and things like that. And I used to go over there and buy those the first couple of days. And a banana. I seem to remember the banana. They had bananas. And then I worked out as just where Ruth was from the address, and I went to see her, and it was quite a long way. It was the other side of Boston. I found her, and she was so pleased. She was really so very pleased, and I was very pleased that I had gone down there. And I used to sit by her bed most of the day, and she was getting better. I do remember being very hungry and looking at her bowls of fruit and boxes of chocolates and cookies that she had, and thinking how nice it would be if she would share them, which she did. I think I was there about 10 days altogether, and a little worried about money. But the one good thing about this was that I had a ticket which was good for me to sail home either from Boston, Halifax, or St. John's. So as long as I had that, I was all right. But finally I said goodbye to Ruth, and just before leaving I went to the Grenfell Mission office in Boston and found that there was a letter for me there from Dr. Curtis up in St.Anthony, and he had told the secretary to give me $50, and there was a short note saying, "You will need this if you ever get to Boston," and just signed Curtis. So there I was, very rich with $50, but of course I should have gone there first. It would have been easier. So I bought the boat home. The Furnace Withy boat, the same one I came over on, and arrived back in Liverpool. I made my way home down to Essex and was back. And my father wondered why I was a little later than I said, that I probably would return, but that was all right. I was there in time for Christmas. But in the following year, in 1950, I decided that I should finish my midwifery training, which was divided into 2 periods of 6 months each. And I had done the first 6 months and decided that I should finish the training, as I said. And I applied to... I must have done part 1 again. So this is all wrong. I must have done part 1 again at the Jewish hospital and passed. Because when I went to St. Anthony, I had part 1. Where did I do part 2? Oh, part 2 I did in Leicester. I lived with the coal miners in that hovel. I remember now. Yes, in 1950, I decided that I must finish my midwifery training. And I wrote to various training schools. And there was a vacancy in Leicester, in the city of Leicester. My sister was living there at the time, which I was pleased about that. And so I went down to Leicester and entered the training school there for Part 2 midwifery. I remember it quite well because it was so very different from nursing in St.Anthony the previous year, because once again I was back in England and hospital there with all the rules and regulations and strict discipline, and the fact that you were training as a midwife meant that you started right at the bottom again with no seniority and of course no real responsibilities. But it was a 6 months training. The first 3 months was spent in the maternity hospital, going to lectures, attending antenatal clinics and delivering babies under supervision. I think that was the first 3 months of the 6 months training. The problem was that, of course, this was following the war. There'd been a great deal of bombing in Leicestershire, and accommodation for the midwives was in very short supply. However, the hospital was obligated to find you accommodation. And I remember very well going to the office to be told where my billet would be, and was told that it was at a certain address and on a certain road in the city. But it wasn't very suitable, as they said. It was not at all suitable. However, I think I had the temerity to inquire, which one never did in those days, just why it was not suitable. And they said, well, it had been condemned. They weren't putting nurses there because it had been condemned by the authorities as not suitable. But there was nowhere else. So off you go. I went to this house with my suitcase of things, and it was not suitable. There was a great deal of coal mining in the outskirts of Leicestershire in those days, and this small house belonged to a coal mining family. Father and 2 sons, all miners, and mother. And it was very small, not very clean, and I had a little room there, I remember, but they were so sparsely furnished that I remember sitting on my suitcases with my books on the bed to study. There was a bathroom. There was no plumbing, indoor plumbing. That was at the bottom of the garden. And of course it was used by the coal mining family. And it was very uncomfortable. The miners, the men, when they came back from the mines, they would wash in the kitchen sink, which was about a couple of feet away from the table where I had my meals when I was there. So it was not very pleasant. But however, as they said, there was nowhere else. And I could go to my sister's when I was off duty, but I couldn't sleep there. Anyway, the time went by, and the first 3 months were completed, and the second 3 months you were outside the hospital, on your own. You had to provide yourself with a bicycle, and they provided a bag which had all your necessary equipment in it for the deliveries, and you were given a section